But while the precise trigger remains uncertain, the wider trend surrounding Himalayan ice is not. The Hindu Kush Himalayan cryosphere is changing rapidly. A major ICIMOD assessment found that glaciers across the region disappeared 65% faster during 2011-2020 than during the previous decade. And a newer ICIMOD assessment released in March 2026 says glacier ice loss rates across the Hindu Kush Himalaya have doubled since 2000. That does not prove climate change directly triggered this particular collapse, but it changes the environment in which these disasters occur. When glaciers shrink, they expose rock. When permafrost thaws, slopes can become less stable. When meltwater accumulates, pressure can increase. New lakes can form on or beside glaciers. Old lakes can expand. Ice cliffs can retreat. And rock that may once have been supported by ice can begin moving. It is a landscape being reorganized. And sometimes that reorganization happens suddenly. Nepal already saw an example of this in 2024. In the Everest region, the famous village of Tem was struck by a catastrophic glacial flood. Later, scientific investigation revealed a remarkable chain reaction. A massive rock avalanche crashed into a glacial lake. The impact generated a displacement wave that damaged the lake barrier. Water escaped. The flood then triggered additional downstream effects. ICIMOD says the event ultimately released hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of water and carried debris for tens of kilometers. Rockfall, lake, wave, dam failure, flood, one hazard creating another and then another. That is what scientists call a cascading disaster. And the August 26 catastrophe appears to belong to the same dangerous family, except there's an even more disturbing precedent. The same broad river corridor was hit by another major glacial flood only last year. On July 8, 2025, a sudden flood surged down the Bote Koshi system near the Nepal-China border. Satellite analysis later showed that a superglacial lake in Tibet had rapidly drained. The flood killed people, left others missing, and destroyed the friendship bridge connecting Nepal and China. Now look at the timeline. 2024, Tem. 2025, Bote Koshi border flood. 2026, another catastrophic flood in the same broad Himalayan region, this time associated with a huge ice rock avalanche. 3 years. 3 dramatic examples of high mountain processes turning into disasters downstream. That does not mean every Himalayan glacier is about to collapse. It does mean the old assumption that hazards can be treated independently is becoming increasingly difficult to defend. A glacier problem becomes a landslide problem. A landslide problem becomes a river problem. A river problem becomes a hydropower problem. A hydropower problem becomes an electricity problem. A destroyed road becomes a rescue problem. A communications failure becomes a missing person crisis. And when the source of the disaster lies near or across an international border, it becomes a coordination problem as well. That is exactly what Nepal is facing now. The avalanche occurred roughly 20 kilometers northeast of the Rasuagadi border crossing. The flood moved through a watershed connected across Nepal and Tibet. Chinese satellite information has helped Nepalese investigators reconstruct the event. Rescue efforts are happening on both sides, but water does not stop at immigration checkpoints. Neither does an avalanche, and this raises perhaps the biggest practical question after the disaster. Can an early warning system detect something like this fast enough? Nepal has experience with river floods. It has flood monitoring stations. It has weather forecasts. It has emergency response agencies. But the warning challenge changes when the source is a glacier collapse. Imagine an instrument downstream detecting a sudden surge. By the time the sensor records it, the flood is already moving. If the river valley is steep, that surge may travel quickly. If communications are destroyed by the first impact, alerts may fail precisely when they are most needed. And if the source is across a border, authorities may need near real-time satellite, seismic, and hydrological information from another country. Minutes matter, sometimes seconds matter. This disaster may therefore force Nepal and China to rethink what early warning actually means in a rapidly changing Himalayan environment. Not simply rain gauges, not simply river gauges, but satellite monitoring, glacier surveillance, automatic cameras, seismic sensors able to distinguish earthquakes from landslides, cross-border data sharing, and systems that can send evacuation alerts immediately when a high-altitude collapse is detected. Because this time, the first assumption was wrong. The seismic signal looked like an earthquake. It was the mountain coming apart. That detail is more than scientific trivia. It changes how future warning systems might interpret similar signals. A sudden seismic event in a glaciated valley may not always mean tectonic movement beneath the ground. It may mean millions of tons of material are already moving on the surface. And if that material enters a river, the real emergency may be happening downstream. For now, however, Nepal's priority remains rescue. The death toll stands at least 162 in the latest Reuters update, and police say they expect it to rise as searches reach more destroyed areas. Hundreds of tourists remain missing or unreachable. Helicopters are delivering supplies and removing survivors while international assistance arrives. But the science happening above the rescue operation may determine what Nepal does next. Investigators will study the fracture zone where the glacier broke away. They will compare satellite images from before and after August 26th. They will examine temperatures, snow cover, melt patterns, slope geometry, rock structure, and any remaining unstable ice. Because there is one question nobody can ignore. Was the collapse complete, or does unstable material remain above the valley? After a major slope failure, surrounding ice and rock do not automatically become safe. The removal of one large section can alter support around neighboring material. Cracks may widen. Loose debris can remain perched on steep slopes. Smaller avalanches can continue. River channels can become blocked again. So, although the catastrophic initial wave has passed, scientists and rescue teams still have to treat the source region carefully. And that brings us back to the title of this story. Nepal has revealed the cause, but only at one level. We now have a much clearer answer to what unleashed the devastation. A large section of glacier and rock collapsed. It crashed more than a kilometer downward. The avalanche entered the river system. Debris blocked the flow. Water accumulated. The barrier failed. And a catastrophic mixture of water, mud, boulders, and ice surged through the valleys below. But the most important mystery remains open. Why did the glacier fail at that exact moment? It was not the earthquake first reported, because that earthquake appears to have been the collapse itself. Was exceptional warmth involved? Did meltwater weaken the glacier? Did changing ice geometry destabilize the slope? Did rock or permafrost conditions play a role? Was it a combination? Those answers will take longer. And perhaps that is what makes this disaster so unsettling. Yesterday, the mystery was the flood. Today, we understand the flood much better. But understanding it has pushed the mystery higher up the mountain, from the river to the glacier. And behind that glacier sits an even larger question about the future of the Himalayas. The region's ice is shrinking faster. Glacial lakes are changing. Rock and ice hazards are interacting. Infrastructure is moving deeper into vulnerable valleys. Millions of people live downstream, and tourists continue traveling through some of the most beautiful and geologically unstable landscapes on Earth. On August 26th, one section of glacier came apart. The collapse lasted only moments, but those moments sent destruction across borders, killed more than 100 people, left hundreds missing, destroyed settlements, cut highways, damaged energy projects, and generated enough seismic energy to fool instruments into thinking an earthquake had occurred. The flood was not the beginning. The real disaster began high above it, where almost nobody could see. And that may be the most important lesson Nepal is confronting tonight. A river can look normal. The sky can show no catastrophic storm. Communities can continue with their daily lives, and thousands of meters above them, the event that changes everything may already be starting. So the question is no longer simply, what caused Nepal's devastating flood? We now know much of that sequence. The harder question is, what caused the mountain to collapse? And how many other unstable slopes are hidden across the Himalayas right now? Because Nepal has found the source of this disaster. But finding the source may have revealed a much bigger danger. For nearly 24 hours, one question has haunted Nepal. Where did the water come from? There had not been the kind of local rainfall that could easily explain what happened. There was no slow river rise, no long warning period, no ordinary flood building over hours. Instead, villages were hit by a wall of mud, rock, ice, and water powerful enough to destroy bridges, bury homes, and cut entire communities off from the outside world. At least 162 people are now confirmed dead. Hundreds more remain missing. Nepal's tourism authorities say 579 tourists are still reported missing or out of contact, including more than 400 foreigners. And investigators now believe they know what initiated the disaster. High above the populated valleys, at an altitude of roughly 5,200 meters, a substantial section of a glacier broke away. It plunged toward the valley floor approximately 1,200 meters below. Ice, rock, snow, sediment. An enormous piece of the mountain came down almost at once. Then the catastrophe accelerated. The collapsing material entered the Lenda River system. Satellite evidence reviewed by Nepalese officials indicates that debris may have temporarily blocked the river roughly 20 kilometers upstream of the Nepal-China border crossing. Water accumulated behind that natural barrier. Then the barrier failed, and everything held behind it came downstream. Not as clear river water, but as a dense destructive mixture of water, boulders, mud, ice, and debris. Downstream, the effect was extraordinary. At one monitoring area, water levels reportedly rose by as much as 9 meters, nearly 30 feet, within only 30 minutes. But here is where this story becomes even stranger. Because when the disaster first happened, officials believed they had discovered the trigger. For earthquake appeared to have struck the region only minutes before the flood. The sequence seemed almost obvious. Earthquake, glacier collapse, avalanche, flood. Except now, that sequence has fallen apart. The United States Geological Survey has re-examined the seismic signal. 4. Earthquake was actually seismic energy produced by the collapse of glacier ice and rock itself, followed by the debris flow. In other words, the earthquake that seemed to explain the disaster never happened in the way people first thought. The mountain collapse created a seismic signature strong enough to resemble an earthquake, which means scientists have answered one enormous question, only to uncover another. If an earthquake did not bring the glacier down, what did? And that is the mystery investigators are now trying to solve, because the immediate cause of the flood is becoming clearer. A glacier failed. Ice and rock crashed downward. The avalanche entered the river system. Debris blocked the water. The temporary barrier failed, and the resulting surge destroyed communities downstream. But why that enormous section of glacier suddenly detached on the morning of August 26th remains under investigation, and that distinction matters, because Nepal is no longer looking only at the aftermath of one flood. It is trying to understand whether the mountains themselves are becoming more unstable. To see why, we have to go back to the moment the disaster began. The Nepal-Tibet border region is one of the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. Massive Himalayan peaks rise above narrow valleys. Glaciers occupy the highest elevations. Rivers cut through steep terrain below. Roads cling to mountainsides. Hydropower stations depend on powerful river systems. Small settlements sit on strips of relatively flat ground beside those rivers. And thousands of tourists and pilgrims travel through the region on their way toward Tibet, including the sacred Mount Kailash and Lake Mansarovar. On a normal day, the geography is breathtaking. During a cascading mountain disaster, the same geography becomes a trap. When the glacier section broke away, gravity took control. Imagine an enormous mass of ice and rock suddenly losing support thousands of meters above sea level. It does not simply slide gently downhill. It accelerates. It breaks apart. Rock fragments collide with more rock. Ice shatters. Snow becomes mixed into the flow. And as that moving mass descends more than a vertical kilometer, it gains enormous destructive energy. By the time it reaches the valley floor, it is no longer simply a piece of glacier. It has become an ice rock avalanche. Nepal's disaster management authorities now describe that avalanche as the immediate driver of the flood. Then, another process appears to have begun. The avalanche reached the river, debris piled into the channel. For a short period, the river was no longer able to flow normally. Think of someone suddenly constructing a dam across a mountain river. Except this dam has no concrete, no spillway, no engineering. It is made from loose ice, broken stone, mud, and shattered mountainside. Water continues flowing into it from upstream. The level rises, pressure builds, and somewhere inside that unstable wall, water begins finding weaknesses. Then the structure gives way. Nepal's flood. Forecasting Division says preliminary satellite imagery from Chinese authorities shows exactly this kind of sequence. An icefall and landslide, the formation of an ice and debris blockage, accumulation of water, and then a sudden release. Officials caution that details are still being investigated. And when that barrier failed, the water carried the mountain with it. That is what made the flood so destructive. Clear water is dangerous, but mud mixed with boulders, trees, ice, vehicles, and building material behaves differently. It is heavier, it has greater impact force, and it can bulldoze through structures that ordinary floodwater might simply surround. One Nepalese flood official put the distinction plainly. The amount of debris dramatically increased the depth and destructive power of the surge. That helps explain the images now coming from the disaster zone. Homes buried to their windows in mud, vehicles crushed or carried away, roads ending abruptly where the landscape has disappeared, power projects damaged, bridges torn from their foundations, entire riverside settlements erased. A health worker in Rasua told Reuters that settlements beside the river had been completely swept away, and that 5 of his own relatives were missing. And the human stories reveal just how fast everything happened. One 68-year-old survivor described seeing an enormous surge of mud moving toward his home. He tried to get his wife toward higher ground. The mud reached them before they could escape. He survived. His wife disappeared beneath the flow. Another survivor saved himself by holding onto a mango tree while the building where he had been working vanished nearby. There was almost no time, and that may be one of the most important differences between this event and a conventional flood. If rain falls for hours, people may see rivers rising. If a cyclone approaches, forecasts can track it days in advance. If a major dam becomes unstable, engineers may detect warning signs. But a glacier collapse high in an inaccessible Himalayan valley can compress the entire warning timeline into minutes. The danger begins where almost nobody lives. Then, gravity transports it rapidly toward places where thousands do. By the time the flood becomes visible downstream, the event that created it may already be irreversible. This is why hundreds of tourists became trapped or disappeared from communication at almost the same time. The disaster struck a major travel corridor. Roads connecting Nepal with the Tibetan border were destroyed, power failed, phone networks collapsed, bridges vanished, the border region was cut apart. More than 400 foreigners are among the 579 tourists currently reported missing or out of contact, including 47 Americans, 34 Australians, 33 British citizens, and 24 Canadians. Authorities stress that some may simply be isolated because communications have failed, meaning the missing list is not the same as a confirmed fatality list. But the rescue operation faces a brutal problem. How do you search an entire mountain valley when the roads used to reach it no longer exist? Helicopters are now doing much of the work. They are carrying food, tents, and emergency supplies. They are searching slopes and riverbanks. They are evacuating survivors. But weather, terrain, and damaged landing zones limit where aircraft can operate. And underneath them, rescuers are not dealing with ordinary streets covered by water. They are dealing with a landscape that has physically changed. River channels have moved, road surfaces are buried, landmarks have disappeared, mud covers homes, trees, and vehicles, and satellite imagery shows areas that were green before the disaster, now covered by massive fields of brown sediment. But now we come back to the bigger mystery. Why did the glacier collapse? One possibility being investigated is temperature. Satellite expert Dan Sugar of the University of Calgary told Reuters that imagery appeared to show substantial snow loss around some glaciers during the 24 hours before the disaster, suggesting unusually warm conditions may have been present. But he also stressed that detailed weather station information was not yet available. Other potential influences, including local construction and longer-term climatic changes, still need investigation. So there's not yet a scientifically established single-root trigger. That is important because it prevents us from making the same mistake twice. First, people saw a seismic signal and assumed an earthquake caused the glacier to collapse. Now USGS says the collapse created the seismic signal. So scientists cannot simply replace one premature explanation with another. They need evidence, temperature records, satellite imagery, the geometry of the failed glacier, rock conditions, permafrost, snowmelt, water pressure, slope stability, and whatever remained beneath the ice before it broke away.